There we go, we're recording. Okay, just to start, we'll start with the land acknowledgement. So we'd like to acknowledge that the greater Peterborough area is a Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe territory in the context of the Rice Lake Treaty 20 and Williams Treaties. We offer our gratitude to the First Nations people on their ongoing care of the earth and our relationships. In keeping with this program, there's much we can learn from approaches to water stewardship that are grounded in Indigenous knowledge and appreciation for the water as sacred, a giver of life, and our most precious resource. And saying that tomorrow is Truth and Reconciliation Day and Orange T-shirt Day, it's very important to remember these things. Okay, so welcome. Thanks for attending our second of our two workshops. We partnered with GreenUP to allow these sustainable low impact landscaping solutions to prepare for flooding and drought. So if you missed our first workshop on the flooding, you can find that on Selwyn's web page under Green Initiatives. So I guess to start with some introductions. So I'm Chantel, like I said before, and I'm the Water and Climate Change Program Assistant with the Township of Selwyn. I'm going to pass it on to Hillary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hillary Bradshaw. I am the Climate Change Coordinator with the Township of Selwyn, and I'll pass it over to Haley.
Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Goodchild. I work with GreenUP. I am a program coordinator in the Neighborhood and Residential Division. I coordinate programs like Deep Paved Paradise, the Rain Garden Subsidy Program in the city of Peterborough, GreenUP's Waterways program, as well as a handful of others. And I'm excited to be here tonight and share a little bit with you about preparing for drought. And yeah, I'll probably leave it there and pass it over to Heather.
Thanks, Haley. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. So my name is Heather, and I am also here from GreenUP. So I'm a director of programs at GreenUP, and I help oversee the programs that we run in our neighborhoods and residential programs department. GreenUP is really excited to partner and work with the Township of Selwyn. We had a lot of fun in our first workshop. And our Deep Pave project as well. If you haven't checked that out yet, check out Stewart Drive in Lakeville.
Okay, so let's not be this guy and we'll be drought ready. So I'll pass it on to Haley to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Chantel, for starting us off in a lovely way. So I'm going to be talking for roughly half an hour, talking a little bit about what drought is, why it matters, but the bulk of the presentation is going to focus on things you can do at home to help prepare for drought. So to start with, what is drought? It is really any sort of prolonged period of dry weather conditions due to a lack of precipitation, but that can also be exacerbated by other factors like temperature and other things like that. And when it comes to drought, the thing to realize or keep in mind is that droughts aren't made or ended sort of in a day, right? They develop over time. And regionally, the organization that's sort of in charge for figuring out whether we're in a drought and how severe that drought is autonomy conservation. And so they meet with a team every so often. And what they do is they look at rainfall measurements and other sorts of factors and decide whether or not our region falls within a certain level. There are 3 levels of drought conditions. For most of 2021, like since the start of spring, our region has been in a level 1 low water condition, and that means that people are asked to voluntarily reduce their water use by 10%. A level 2 low water condition, which does happen, it has happened before, last year, and also especially, I believe, 2016, when there was a really severe drought, in that sort of condition, people are encouraged to make a 20% reduction in their water use. And then there's a level 3 condition in which autonomy conservation actually has the authority to sort of impose restrictions on water, through things like revoking permits, permits to take water and that sort of thing. To my knowledge, there has not been a level 3 drought declared before, although we have come close and we seem to be coming closer all the time. So I think we can move on to the next slide. It's important to understand when we're thinking about drought, it's important to understand what it actually does in our ecosystems and why it's damaging. And in order to understand that, we need to know a little bit about the natural water cycle. And so there's 3 infographics here, and the one on the left sort of illustrates in a very highly simplified way the natural water cycle in ideal conditions. And what happens is that rain falls, and most of that water, a good chunk of that water, actually filters into the ground. It helps feed plants and trees and all sorts of life, and it also is restored. It restores the groundwater levels. Part of that water does become runoff, and so it runs off overland into streams and rivers and that sort of thing. And then through a process called evapotranspiration, that moisture is taken back up and then it falls again. And that's what happens in an ideal setting. When we're in periods of drought, that balance of that natural water cycle is disrupted. And so what happens, obviously, there's less rain falling. And so those the groundwater isn't able to be restored in the same way. Stream levels, waterway levels come down quite a bit, and that can sort of set off a series of impacts that can be quite detrimental. For those of you who may be in urban centers, even small ones like, such as Lakefield, drought is especially damaging because the urban water cycle is already out of balance. Because of the amount of paving that we have in our urban settings, there's already not enough water filtering down into the ground to restore groundwater levels. You actually get more runoff into streams and rivers, which can have its own sort of detrimental effects. And that whole cycle just doesn't quite function the way we want it to. And so in periods of drought, all of these things are sort of made more severe, and over time can make our ecosystems and our communities less resilient. All right, we can go to the next slide. And so why does this matter, sort of in terms that, make sense to us on a day-to-day basis? Well, one of those things is, yes, it impacts groundwater, and particularly for folks who may be living in more rural communities, it can affect well levels. And that, of course, can be very scary when you're dependent on wells for water. My husband's aunt and uncle live in Selwyn, and in 2016, their well went dry for the first time ever that they have been there in decades, and I think was really scary for them. So that's a really obvious, tangible impact. Drought can also put trees and other green infrastructure at risk. Now, green infrastructure, if you're not familiar with that term or what that is, it's really just a way of describing systems that leverage nature. So whether that's trees or other kinds of vegetation, for example, in order to fulfill sort of benefits and services for people. So it might be a rain garden, for instance, that helps absorb water to take it away from the stormwater system. That would be an example of green infrastructure. It can also impact traditional infrastructure. I may need at some point Heather to clarify these details. I think she knows it better than I do, but my understanding is that in a drought, it seems counterintuitive, but if people actually reduce their water consumption too much, that can actually even cause issues for our conventional infrastructure systems that require a certain amount of water moving through them to actually function correctly. So all kinds of sort of fine balances that we need to think about when it comes to drought. Heather, is that correct? Do you want to fill anything in there?
No, that's correct. Yeah, there's a certain amount of water that needs to go through that system to keep it working. So we don't want to cut it too far, but we want to just make sure we're cutting our water use in the right places.
Yeah, absolutely. Another significant impact, of course, is on farmers and just the economy in general. So droughts, depending on especially when they take place, like this spring, it was very dry early on, which was very unnerving and detrimental for many farmers who, of course, are seeding, doing a lot of seeding at that time. So that can have a really big impact. And then, of course, it harms aquatic wildlife and just general watershed health. And so the image that is on this slide, it's probably hard to see some of the details at this scale, but this is an image of the area, sort of including Lakefield and surrounding Lakefield a little bit, and it shows a number of the existing wetlands. But yeah, thank you there, Hillary. A number of the existing wetlands, because of course this region is really blessed by a lot of wetlands that are super, super important, not just because they have inherent value as particular ecosystems and, you know, sources of really significant biodiversity, but also because they're really critical for dealing with climate change. They can sequester a lot of carbon and help our, you know, communities better manage the volatility of weather that we might expect under climate change. But of course, long extended droughts can really impact them over time. All right. Speaking of climate change, in the greater Peterborough region, droughts are expected to increase in frequency, duration, and intensity as climate change worsens. And at this point, it's really not a question of whether drought is going to get worse locally. It's probably more a question of degree, depending on how much, you know, collectively as a society, we're able to rein in greenhouse gas emissions and keep the average global temperature rising as little as we can, right? But some of this is already sort of baked in, so to speak. And so it's important in that context that we start really thinking about what can we do if droughts are going to become a constant, right, in our lives. So I guess I would start this by saying be prepared, and the best time to plan for drought is, you know, now, is yesterday, is, you know, very, very soon, not, you know, in the midst of a drought. I mean, of course, there are things you can do in the moment if you're in an area that's experiencing drought, but the best thing to do is to start thinking about it when you have time and when you're not sort of in a crisis management kind of mode. And in the same way that drought isn't sort of created or ended in a day, like I was saying before, I think drought sort of drought mitigation or drought response strategies aren't either, right? The best sort of strategies are going to be ones that are built over time. So also don't feel pressure as I'm going through this to be like, oh gosh, I have to do all of this now, I have to do all of this tomorrow. The strategies can also be implemented over time. So what are some of those strategies? And I'm going to say I am focusing primarily on outdoor water use. There are, of course, things you can do indoors as well in terms of, you know, low flow toilets and all the rest of it. But today's focus is going to be on outdoor water use. So one of the best ways to deal with drought on your property at home is to install a rain barrel or 2 or 5 or however many you feel you have the capacity to support, and to collect water. And rain barrels, what they do is they collect water from impermeable surfaces, typically from a roof via a downspout. Now this can be a really great strategy for managing drought for a couple of reasons. well, in cities, so in urban areas, they have the not only are they giving you water that you can then use for, watering gardens, that sort of thing, they have the added benefit of actually helping slow down and reduce the amount of water that immediately goes into the urban stormwater system during a high precipitation event. In rural settings, we were talking about the pressure on wells and all that entails. Rain barrels are an excellent strategy because they mean you are less dependent on using well water for outdoor water needs, which is important. Another thing you can do is just water less frequently, ideally. And if you must water, let's say you have really sensitive plants or like a big vegetable garden like I do, and watering is important. It's hard to get away with not watering vegetables. Best practice is to water early in the morning or later in the evening, not in the middle of the day, which is when the sort of evaporation, the rate of evaporation will be the highest. Another thing you can do is to install drip hoses or a highly efficient irrigation system that uses water more efficiently. Watering your garden with like a hose and a spray tap is typically one of the least efficient ways to water. And so something like this can just reduce the overall volume of water that you actually end up using to water plants and gardens. And then this one I think is easy to forget, but regularly inspect your outdoor taps and hoses for leaks. I was sharing earlier today, I was telling Hillary and Chantel a story about how my partner and I moved into our house and didn't discover a leak in a buried hose for like the first 2 years that we were here. And I was absolutely horrified when we figured it out, that we had this tiny slow trickle during the growing season happening underground, right? So that's important. Stay on top of it and then repair those sorts of things as soon as you find them. Okay. Water-friendly lawn practices. So GreenUP, and I'm going to get there, GreenUP is often an advocate of de-lawning, of replacing lawns with gardens. That said, there's definitely a time and place for lawns. They can be really great spaces for playing, for dogs, for all sorts of things. And so what we suggest, if you do have a lawn, is that you adopt water-friendly practices in order to make your lawn as drought tolerant as possible. So some of the ways to do this are, you can allow your lawn to go dormant during summer droughts. So your lawn, your grass will not die if it's going brown and you're not watering it. It will bounce back when it starts to rain again. So that is an option. And although it is not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing thing in the world, embrace it. Let your lawn go brown or go yellow or whatever in order to reduce the amount of water you are using. Another thing you can do is to mow high and less often. So try setting your mower so that it mows about 2 to 3 inches above the ground rather than like a very close shave, so to speak. And just try to mow less often. If you don't need it to be super, super low for access and walking through, then just see if you can cut how often you are mowing your lawn. Another strategy that you can use, if your lawn is primarily sort of a thoroughfare, like a way that you're trying to get from A to B, then you could try just keeping a single path mowed a little bit more and letting other parts of your lawn sit a little bit higher and not mow them quite as often. Another sort of general practice or suggestion we have is not to use artificial pesticides or fertilizers. I mean, in a perfect world, they're not great for all kinds of reasons, but in connection with drought, they can be quite hard on plants that are already stressed from droughts, like grass and other plants in your lawn that might already be stressed by drought, but also in really dry conditions, when they do get water, that water just really moves quickly down into the groundwater. sort of level, and we don't necessarily want those chemicals and those artificial fertilizers and those sorts of things heading down that way. And then finally, you can introduce drought tolerant plants to your lawn. Your lawn doesn't need to be a monoculture or, you know, a collection of just a handful of different turf grasses. In fact, the idea of a highly sort of, word I'm looking for, I guess monoculture, but, you know, sanitized looking lawn is actually quite a recent one. Even just a few decades ago, a lot of lawn mixes, for instance, came with white clover, which is sometimes now considered something that needs to be eradicated. And so it's great if you want to add things like white clover, yarrow, native violets. There are other kinds of plants that can be included to make your lawn ecosystem a little more biodiverse. And if you want to do that, there are a few ways. In my experience, I've had the most luck with sort of thatching the lawn a little bit, laying down maybe a very, very thin layer of soil and adding some seed and sort of tamping it down, and that helps it take a little bit better than it might if you just toss seed down onto the existing lawn. But yeah, this photo here is from my lawn where we have been very slowly seeding with more white clover. There we go. Okay, next slide. Planting trees and gardens instead of lawns. So this is a great way to reduce your outdoor water use once gardens are established. Of course, a newly planted garden will require a certain level of watering for the first year or two. But this is the reason that planting trees and gardens can be more water conscious and more drought tolerant than lawns has to do with roots, right? Most turf that we use for a conventional lawn has very shallow roots. It can't hang on to a lot of water. That soil dries out really quickly. But with a garden that includes plants that are sort of appropriate for this use, what you get are a lot of plants with diverse root structures that can access water that, you know, is sort of well below the surface of the soil, and it can also just help hold water in the entire soil ecosystem a little bit better. So replacing all or even just part of your lawn with a drought tolerant garden is a great way to reduce overall outdoor water use and help restore that natural water balance that I was talking about at the beginning. One of the things we suggest is that you apply mulch at the time of planting as well, and that will really help reduce moisture loss, especially while plants become established and when you might have to do a little more watering up front. Okay, that said, there can be too much of a good thing. Mulch is wonderful when it is used appropriately and sort of in the right amounts, but there are certain practices to keep in mind. On the left here, there's a photo of what you might have heard termed before a mulch volcano. And that's when big piles of mulch are sort of amassed around the trunk of trees. So it doesn't have to be trees. It could also just be in a garden bed, like super thick and piled up against the stems of different plants. And this can actually kill trees over time. It really, you know, trees need to access, all plants need to access oxygen as well as water. And so adding that much mulch over the soil can really be detrimental. And it can also cause like fungal issues and rot, a greater susceptibility to disease within the plant as well. Better practice is what you see on the right, where a thinner layer of mulch has been placed with a bit of a gap between the tree trunk and the mulch. So typically you want to keep your mulch level to no more than a couple of inches and to keep a few inches of space between those plants and the beginning of the mulch ring. Okay. So if you are interested in either establishing a drought tolerant garden or if you have a garden area that you want to amend with more drought tolerant plants, perhaps because you're noticing that some of them do require a fair amount of watering and you want to reduce that. Here are some suggestions. This is by no means an exhaustive list, not even close. And I believe, I don't know if Hillary has the link handy. If she doesn't, maybe Heather can throw it in. GreenUP does have a sustainable landscaping guide, which in the back has a somewhat longer list, a sort of chart of many different plants that it tells you, is this plant reasonably drought tolerant? Is it salt tolerant? Is it good for rain garden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to dig into this a little bit more and see a wider selection of plants, I encourage you to do that. However, here are a handful that I've decided to pick either because I really like them or because they're particularly good. They have particularly good drought tolerance. Many of them are native, not necessarily all, but that's another good thing to keep in mind. As much as possible, it is wise to plant native plants. They are often sort of better evolved to not be coddled in the garden, so to speak, right? They can handle some of the toughness that life and weather throws at us. One example that you see in the photo here is called prairie smoke. So this one's, I think, getting really popular because it's got quite an ornamental sort of fancy little seed head that you see in the photo there. It is native to North America and to parts of Ontario. And it is highly drought tolerant. I have this growing right on the edge of my west facing, feels like a desert front yard, right next to the sidewalk where it gets salt. It just gets like, 12 hours of sun during the summer, and it is doing quite well. And I have very sandy, rocky soil too, I should add that. So it's an excellent selection. It's very low growing and helps spread a little bit as a ground cover. There are many other wildflowers, so many of the asters, butterfly milkweed, many of the rudbeckias, which are like black-eyed Susans is the common name that you'd often hear, prairie smoke, yarrow. Those are all excellent options for drought-tolerant full sun wildflowers. If you're looking for shrubs, things like creeping juniper, really any of the junipers, but creeping juniper tends to be used more in a sort of ornamental fashion. It's really tough as nails. Fragrant sumac, which can handle greater moisture too, and in fact probably prefers that, can also nonetheless handle quite a lot of drought. Potentilla is another one. We do have some potentilla planted at the Deepave garden at Winfield Shores Harbor, so if you want to see it in the flesh, in the leaf, so to speak, you can go over there and take a look at it. It's a nice one also because it stays a little more contained. A lot of our native shrubs tend to get large. Potentilla stays fairly small at about 4 feet, which is nice. Trees, certain trees, not all trees, but certain trees are drought tolerant. This is just a very small selection. Certain oaks, so not all oaks, but some oaks, especially bur oak and I think chinkapin oak, tend to have quite high drought tolerance. Hackberry is increasingly planted in many urban settings. It's actually a floodplain species, a bottomland species, but has a remarkable drought tolerance considering that. Red cedar also, for example, very drought tolerant. And then last, but certainly not least, a lot of our native grasses, they really are well suited to those sort of seasonal summer droughts. So things like little blue stem, for instance, side oats grama, Indian grass. There's a whole number of them that do really well in drought conditions. Okay. Thank you. There are also drought tolerant plants for shade. So some of the wildflowers that you might want to consider adding to your shade gardens would be Canada anemone. It spreads quite a bit. It really sort of fills in. Some people say too much. It can be a little aggressive. But I think that's also it tends to do that when it has its preferred sort of medium level moisture. In drier conditions, I think it stays a little more contained and can handle those drought conditions. Not native, but hostas, a lot of people associate, they also have a wide sort of amplitude, they can tolerate a wide level of moisture conditions, but actually do quite well in dry shade. Wild ginger, which is native, can tolerate dry shade. I have some wild ginger growing under Norway maple canopy. And if you know anything about Norway maples, they are bullies. They take up all available space and moisture in the soil underground. So if wild ginger can hang on in that sort of condition, then you know it's a good drought tolerant plant for shade. And then the one that's pictured here in the photo is zigzag goldenrod, which is a fun one. It can handle full shade. It also can handle part sun conditions. And it's not quite as drought tolerant perhaps as some of the others that I've mentioned there, but can certainly be included. Fragrant sumac is here again because it can also grow in part shade conditions. It won't flower as much and it won't have the same striking fall color, but can certainly grow in those conditions. Low bush honeysuckle, which is a lower sort of shorter stature native shrub, does well in shade. Witch hazel is also similar. Again, hackberry does have some shade tolerance, and white cedar, which we tend to associate, and it's true, white cedar with really sort of moist sort of stream edges. It really loves those conditions. It's also remarkably drought tolerant, which is quite something. And then finally, native sedges and grasses. So sedges aren't actually technically a grass, even though they look like them. Those can be really great things to include in dry shade gardens. So Pennsylvania sedge has become a really popular one ornamentally. I have to say it's really hard to find locally. I can't find a good local supplier, but so if anyone knows one, please tell me. And also northern sea oats, which is actually like a grass and a bit taller and quite ornamental. And it's one of the few native grasses we have that is quite shade tolerant. Don't forget ground covers. So some of the plants that I have mentioned here do sort of function as ground covers, but I wanted to leave you with this, because if you want to take your sort of your water conscious landscaping, your drought tolerant landscaping to the next level, then you should consider including non-invasive ground covers in your garden as a strategy to actually replace and reduce the amount of mulch that you need over time, because plants at the end of the day are better at retaining moisture in the soil than mulches because of their root systems. And so you can allow them to spread beneath and between taller plants. And so over time, your need for regular applications of mulch will decline. And in this photo here, you can see a combination of well, you can't tell it's a slope necessarily from that photo, but that's in my backyard, quite steeply sloped, and that's bearberry and wild strawberry that have knit together to function as a bit of a ground cover. When I moved in, this slope was entirely periwinkle, which is an invasive ground cover, and it is drought tolerant and very pretty and appealing in many ways, but also not great at all for our local ecosystem. So good to choose alternatives such as this. I'm going to take a breath. I think I forgot to mention a point way back there that I was going to say about, we were talking about fall earlier today and leaving your leaves as another thing to do that's important, not just in your gardens, but actually especially on your lawns if you want to help boost their resilience for future years and sort of return nutrients to the grass. So that's another good thing to do. But I will stop talking. And now Hillary and Chantal can tell us a little bit more about the rain barrel subsidies.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Haley. It was very interesting and a lot of good information in there. So yeah, on to our subsidies. So with GreenUP, Selwyn has offered a subsidy program for $50 off a rain barrel. So that's going up until the end of December now. So you can just buy that directly on GreenUP's website under the shop function, and you can also fill out the subsidy form right there. So everything can be all done at once, and then you can pick it up at the GreenUP shop in Peterborough. And lucky for you guys are all going to be entered in to win a free rain barrel from this webinar. So we will let the lucky winner know that shortly. So on the topic of rain barrels, I thought we should, based on the season of fall, we should talk about how to winterize your rain barrel and the getting that ready for the winter season. Let's see if that'll play. Okay, so step one is to drain out all the water out of your rain barrel and leave the spigot open. Step two is to remove the lid and anything else that is attached to the barrel. So just getting all that equipment off of it. Step three is to detach the barrel from the gutter or the downspout. Oh, we're only on step two. And then step four is to store your barrel upside down in a shed or garage or anywhere that's sheltered. Video's a little glitchy there. So pretty easy, just detach everything on it, make sure there's no water left inside of it and turn it upside down so nothing freezes inside of it. So if you guys have any questions for us, now's your time.
Yeah, so if anyone has some questions, I've stopped the slideshow. We will submit the slideshow to everybody that participated tonight, just so that you have on hand the link for this this live video. If you have any questions, also, you know, a week from now, feel free to email us, and we'd be happy to answer any of the questions. So. So it looks like Heather has a pro tip about winterizing the rain barrel. So Heather mentioned put some steel wool in the elbow and spigot. So not sure if that because, you know, critters would go in there or get like moldy sort of thing.
It's definitely a way to just keep those critters from forming a little house in your rain barrel while it's being stored over the winter.
That's a good call. That is a good call. So does anyone have any questions off the top of their head? If you want, you can also just submit the question in the chat box, and I'll read it. And if you don't want to talk over the line. So I have a question, Haley. So your ground cover that you had a picture of for your slope, how many plants did you actually plant before it started to look like that? You know, starting to think about, you know, fall is a good time to do some of the last minute or some extra gardening so that the roots establish over the winter and spring. So wondering just how many plants you actually planted for that slope.
That's a good question. And thank you for that extra tip. Also what I forgot on the garden slide. Fall's a great time to plant your gardens because they have more time to get ready and strong before most likely the first big drought. Rather, you know, as opposed to when you plant in the spring and they're immediately like, bam, lots of drought. So that's important. Thank you, Hillary. In terms of that slope, so to give you a better sense of what you're looking at, the whole sort of slope there, that patch of bearberry and wild strawberry is probably about 3 feet by about 9 feet long. Now, the number of plants, I want to say that I planted 4 bearberry, and there were 4 4-inch pots, so they weren't very big. They were pretty small when they went in. And I have, so my property, just wild strawberry is there and it is happy and it is thrilled. So it was already sort of starting to creep into that area. I maybe like dug up and transplanted a few to sort of spread them out a little more, you know, throughout that space, maybe like 6, but so let's say 10 plants, right? Which is not a lot. That is not a dense planting at all. And that came from out of me being frugal and yeah, just deciding not to plant it as densely as maybe I needed or, you know, could have right off the bat. So not a lot. That said, it has taken 3 years for it to reach the point that you see in that photo. So that photo was from this summer, midsummer, that was like July. So it definitely took time. And in part that is just because there weren't a whole lot of plants right off the bat. And I will say that bearberry, while it's an exceptional ground cover, it's super drought tolerant. It is slow as molasses to spread, in my experience. I don't know, maybe in other conditions it would move more quickly, but it is really slow. So if you do want that coverage quickly, then I would plant a little more densely than I did. Wild strawberry, on the other hand, that fills in mighty quick, at least on my property. So does that help?
Definitely, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'll continue to ask questions. So kind of to tie in, you know, this is our second workshop, learning about drought tolerance, and our first one was about flood preparedness. Now, is there an optimal distance that you should be planting, you know, any kind of garden or these species from your house or building? Especially knowing that we want those roots to be deep in the ground. You know, is there an infrastructure issue? So just wondering, you know, both for a drought tolerant plant, and then also, I know Heather, you could speak on the flood preparedness type of plants. So kind of what's an average distance that you should maybe stay clear from planting from your own home or building?
Yeah, it's a good question, and Heather, let me know if you wanna jump in. So there's a couple things here. So one of the things that often gets talked about in terms of dealing with excess water, or, you know, stormwater, or flooding, a lot of people talk about rain gardens. And so rain gardens, if you're not familiar with them, are bowl-shaped gardens that take in water off an impermeable surface and divert it from the stormwater system and sort of divert it to a safe place where it can then soak into the ground. And so for something like that, typically what we recommend is a minimum of 3 meters or 10 feet from your foundation to be super safe and make sure that you are not just essentially forcing a whole lot of water in next to your foundation, because of course you don't want that kind of impact, or a damp basement or anything like that. Some places recommend less, like the 10 feet is really a conservative measure. I've certainly seen and heard of people putting in rain gardens at 6 feet from foundations. And there are even ways that if you don't just have that space, you can very carefully, by putting in sort of deep, I don't know, like waterproofing layers, go even closer, but that's complicated. The funny thing about rain gardens, we tend to associate them with too much water, right? And diverting water away from the stormwater system. But in reality, they often are and need to actually have some inherent drought tolerance to them, because the way they're supposed to function is to take in a lot of water at once, and then perhaps not very much at all for a very long time. So those can actually handle frequently those two different conditions of excess water and drought. In terms of sort of plantings, sort of in relation to you know, other considerations around sort of drought tolerant plantings and so on, one that comes to mind is that if you're adding a tree, for instance, trees are wonderful for you know, helping shade soil, which helps retain soil moisture a little bit more, for instance. you do need to be thoughtful and careful about where you're planting a tree in proximity to your home and to your foundation. And certain trees, typically not the drought tolerant ones, but certain trees love water and will look anywhere for it, including your house and your water lines and your sewers, your pipes, that sort of thing. So things like willows and silver maples, a lot of maples, but you know, things like that, you'd want to be keeping them quite a distance. I actually don't know off the top of my head what a sort of good like guideline, general guideline would be. But if you consider that roots tend to extend at the very least to the edge of the drip line, the canopy of a tree, if not further, then you'd want to situate a tree very further away. Other trees, however, particularly ones with tap roots that have a big tap root and are less, you know, the reachy, that's the technical term, the reachy roots, they are going to be less of a risk for your foundation, and also usually more drought tolerant because of those tap roots that can access water much further down. So those are two considerations that come to mind. Heather, do you have others?
I think those are some really great ones. I think when it comes to planting, like up to your foundation, it's really how you're landscaping. It's really what you want to keep an eye on. So if you're changing that slope, you really want to be careful with that. But otherwise, those are great places to put drought tolerant plants. Often, you know, they're not going to get, especially if you have any roof painting, they're not going to get a lot of water in under there. So it might be a significant different kind of ring around your home worth of type of plantings before you get, you know, 2 feet out from underneath that awning. Yeah, so just watch your slope is, I guess, what I would recommend. So I don't think you'd have to worry about any of the native species root systems being too long for those areas. And one of the things we also recommend is when you water plants, is watering them for a really long, like water them less frequently, but for longer. So generally I recommend like standing there with your watering can and maybe singing a song to yourself and keep watering it for the length of the song. And that's going to help the roots go down really far. And so I recommend that, especially around your home. If you're watering, to just give it a chance for that water to really go down and not sideways. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, I have had to learn how to properly water plants because, which is funny because I'm a farmer, so I should know how to water plants, but mostly it's on larger scale, so I'm not watering it. But on my personal little gardens, I had to learn that, you know, the pretty, you know, aesthetically, you know, every movie look of it's just sprinkling down, you know, that's not efficient. And it takes more time on my end, and then also isn't getting the water really to what is needed, which is the roots. So I've had to retrain myself on doing it like that.
Me too. Also grew up as a farmer and also never got to, you know, really think about how was I watering things. And so in true farmer fashion, what I recommend as a fun tip for folks who just maybe don't have the time to stand out there and water like that at the root base, is to use a bucket, grab a 5-gallon bucket, drill some holes in the bottom of it, and strategically place them and then fill your buckets and then leave them. So a lot of times laziness, what we would perceive as laziness is actually the green way to go. I was thinking about that, Haley, when you were talking about not cutting your grass. And I was like, oh, good. I haven't cut my grass in a little while. I'm so glad I haven't. I'm so glad that I left that. You know, it's only a little bit up, but it is better for the water.
Totally. Yeah. So it's 7:52. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to give us a shout via email. As I said, we will send this recording out to everybody that participated tonight. So a huge thank you to Peterborough GreenUP, especially to Haley and Heather for their wonderful collaboration and networking for this project for Rain Ready. And again, just highlighting if you have any time in Lakefield to stop by at the Stewart Drive at Winfield Shores, as Peterborough GreenUP has installed or de-installed a deep paved project. So it's a beautiful garden, and if you want to stop by and have a look at that, again, the information about how to purchase a rain barrel through the Selwyn Township subsidy, it's right on the Peterborough GreenUP's website. If you hit shop, and then there's a specific one that will say Selwyn residents only. So without further ado, thank you everybody for joining tonight. Thanks for doing yet another webinar, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
evening.
you.